Hi, ninth grade. Good to see you today. I hope you enjoyed your Spirit Day dance party and had a chance to have some fun with Mr. Helnick and Mr. Bolden. We are going to continue on page 208 in Into the Clouds. And this is now the place where they've made it to one of the camps, and they've also lost one of their climbing partners. Chapter 18, Fellowship of the Rope, page 208. At some point in the night, the wind died, as though a whimsical god decided they'd suffered enough for now. But in the two tiny tents, wedged into the mountainside at 24,000 feet, no one felt secure. Shonu, Craig, and Strether had stuffed themselves inside the one-person tent. They sat shoulder to shoulder with their backs against the ice slope, afraid to move around. At their feet, a third of the tent hung over the ledge. A little more weight on that end, and the tent would slip off the edge and carry them with it. If an avalanche didn't do the job first. Hundreds of tons of fresh snow still covered the slope above their heads, poised to rumble down the mountain at any time. In the larger tent, they had another hazard to contend with. Charlie Houston. Houston and Bates sat wedged between Bell and Molinar. A single air mattress gave them some insulation from the cold. Bates had wrapped a sleeping bag around their legs, and Molinar insisted on giving his down jacket to Houston to keep him warm. But as the night wore on, it wasn't Houston's body temperature they worried about. It was his mind. Houston seemed to be grasping what had happened to them, but it didn't bring him much comfort. He spent the first part of the night worrying in turn about anyone he couldn't see. "How's Pete?" he would ask. "He's fine," Bates would answer. Not convinced that Bates was an authority on the subject, Houston would ask again. Finally, Bates would call out to the other tent, "Hey, Pete, tell Charlie you're all right." "I'm fine, Charlie," Pete would say. "Don't worry about me." That would buy a minute or two of silence until they'd hear, "How's Tony?" Eventually, Houston's own struggles distracted him. He had bruised a rib in the fall, and every breath sent a stab of pain through his chest. But he decided his breathing problems had nothing to do with his body. He kept reaching up to tear a hole in the tent, insisting they needed more oxygen. Molinar finally opened the tent door, but even that didn't satisfy Houston. "I know about these things," Houston said urgently. "I have studied them. We'll all be dead in 3 minutes if you don't let me cut a hole in the tent." The next morning, 7 men emerged onto the slope, having breathed well enough to make it through the night. They had barely slept and they were battered from the fall, but there was work to do. They struck the tents and gathered their gear. The wind had returned, and as they peered down toward Camp 6, the jagged rocks of the Black Pyramid faded into a dense fog. But there was no discussion of the weather and no debate over whether or not to climb today. They needed to get down the mountain before frostbite or altitude sickness crippled them all. The question for the day was whether Houston and Bell could negotiate the Black Pyramid under their own power. Bell's feet were so swollen it took a couple of people to get them into his boots. To make matters worse, he had lost his glasses in the fall. Even if his feet would support him, he could barely see where to put them. As for Houston, no one knew what to expect. Maybe his years of climbing experience would take over and guide him down the mountain. If not, he could be a danger to anyone climbing with him. Schoening and Craig, the two strongest climbers, tied Houston between them and started down the mountain. Great sheets of snow spray whipped at their hands as they grappled for holds. Not far into the climb, Houston sat down on a ledge. He looked around as though once again it took a supreme effort to figure out how he had been plucked from his medical practice in Exeter, New Hampshire, and deposited on a mountainside in Asia. From above, Shoney shook the rope and told him to get moving. Houston picked himself up and climbed. Above them, Bates, Bell, Molinar, and Strether climbed rope together. They took turns, stopping to belay one another, clipped into a python or clinging to an ice axe jammed into a patch of crusty snow. But no one had much faith that he would be able to stop a fall. Bell's hands and feet were barely functional. Molinar's injured leg throbbed when he took a step, and his ribs made it painful to reach. On the way down, they spotted Houston's ice axe lying on an outcropping of rock. Molinar traversed to get it and handed it to Bell, who had lost his in the fall. Bates watched from above as Bell picked his way down, leaning dangerously out over the slope to tap the rock with the ice like a blind man. By mid-afternoon, Schoenig and Craig had guided Houston to the final pitch above Camp 6. As they neared the camp, a solemn sight came into view. Pat Schoenig paused for a moment and looked to his left. About 1,000 feet below the spot where he had held Art Gilkey fast to the mountainside, a sleeping bag dangled from a ledge, swinging empty in the wind. Below it for 500 feet or so, the rocks were stained with blood. They passed the pitch without much said. Not long after, Strother, Bell, Molinar, and Bates reached the same spot. Bell could barely stand, and Molinar felt nearly hysterical from weakness. Still, the evidence of Gilkey's last moments had a deep impact on them all. It would be a long time before they could talk about it. They were painfully aware that Gilkey's death had probably saved them, but that didn't make it easier to stomach. Bates told himself that Gilkey had been knocked unconscious on the rocks and hadn't suffered during the fall. In the relative comfort of Camp 6 that night, Molinar recorded in his diary, "Poor Art." By 6:00 p.m., they had dug out the tents and settled in at Camp 6. Someone worked the stove, putting together a feast of rice, tomato soup, canned ham, and tea. Then they dug up a radio they had left in camp. They had lost the other one in the fall and hadn't called Ataulla in more than a day and a half. Houston was lucid enough to make the call. "Thank God," Atta said when he heard Houston's voice. Since 3:00 p.m. the day before, Ataulla had been sitting by his radio waiting for a call. He'd been planning to search the glacier the next day for evidence of an avalanche. As soon as the weather broke, he was going to climb as high as he could to go look for them, but he had convinced himself they were probably dead. The next day, Schoenig and Strother descended ahead to Camp 5 and made tea for the others. By nightfall, the rest of the team still hadn't arrived. The wind had picked up at Camp 6 and it was bitter cold. They decided they couldn't risk Bell's feet by climbing, and Bob Craig was showing signs of bad frostbite as well. They would take a rest day and hope for better weather tomorrow. Finally, on August 13th, 3 days after they had started down with Gilkey's cocoon, the entire team stumbled down the mountain to House's chimney. A month ago, on the way up, it had taken them 5 minutes to descend from Camp 5 to the top of the chimney. Now, on the edge of total exhaustion, it took them an hour. One by one, they rappelled down the 80-foot groove in the cliff. Houston, who was feeling better but still recovering from his concussion, insisted on belaying everyone from the top. He dug in, wrapped the rope around his hips, and lowered his teammates slowly down the cliff. After each man went a backpack. It was slow, painstaking work. And by the time Bob Bates swung out over the edge and climbed down, it was nearly dark. Charlie Houston stood alone at the top of House's chimney. On the way up the mountain, this had been the site of his triumph. He had sat on the ledge after leading the climb with half the Karakoram laid out beneath him, feeling like he belonged on this mountain, like he had unlocked the gate to the summit of K2. It was just over a month ago, but it might as well have been 20 years. Now he peered down the chimney, flooded with doubt. Below him hung not just the rope he needed, but old rotten ropes from 38 and 39. What if he picked the wrong rope? What if he made a mistake on the way down? He could fall on Schoenig, who was waiting at the base of the chimney to lead him into Camp 4. He could break a leg and become yet another burden to the team. The thought occurred to him that he should just jump. For a moment, he stood on the edge of the 80-foot cliff, still in a fog from his concussion. Just a step or two forward, and he would have joined Art Gilkey, Dudley Wolfe, and Passan Kukuli, entombed on the Abruzzi Ridge for centuries to come. Then, from 80 feet away, he could hear Schoenig and maybe the others yelling at him to come down. He mumbled the Lord's Prayer into the wind and lowered himself off the side. When Pete Schoenig welcomed Houston at the base of House's chimney, he had no idea how close the team had come to another tragedy. For Houston, the moment had passed. He climbed into a tent at Camp 4 with Bates and Molinar, knowing they were almost off the mountain. Tomorrow they would have to cut Bell's boots to make them fit his swollen feet. But they had escaped the worst that K2 had to offer. They would all get home alive. We'll stop there on page 215. Thank you so much, ninth graders. This is a great read, and we're almost finished with this amazing book. Take care of yourselves, okay? See you later. Bye-bye now.